On Mother's Day, I hugged my mom, handed her flowers, and told her how much she meant to me. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't read. Then she pressed a plain white envelope into my hand and whispered, "Open it when you're alone." I thought it was a sweet letter, or maybe something sentimental she didn't want to share in front of the family. But later that night, when I sat on my couch and slid the letter out, I felt my whole world tilt. In just a few pages, everything I thought I knew about my life changed. And that was the last time I ever spoke to her. My name is Emily Carter, and I had always believed I came from a normal, loving family. My mom, Linda, was warm and social, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthdays and baked pies for neighbors. My dad, Thomas, was quieter but steady, the kind of man you could depend on. I had an older brother, Matthew, who always looked out for me even if we didn't talk every day. That morning, we were at my parents' house for our traditional Mother's Day brunch. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon rolls and coffee, and sunlight poured through the windows. We laughed, told old stories, and for a while, it felt like any other family gathering. There was no sign that anything was wrong. After brunch, my dad and Matthew started cleaning up in the kitchen while my mom and I moved into the living room. She sat across from me, holding her coffee cup with both hands, her eyes studying me in a way that made me a little uneasy. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out the envelope. Her voice was soft but serious when she said, "Open it when you're alone. Please, Emily." It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, almost like she was bracing for something. I nodded, but my curiosity was already burning. I slipped the envelope into my bag and tried to shake off the strange feeling. We hugged goodbye, and as I drove home, I kept wondering what could possibly be inside. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for hours while I distracted myself with chores. I washed dishes, folded laundry, and scrolled through my phone, telling myself I'd open it later. But every time I walked past it, I felt my stomach tighten. My mom's voice kept replaying in my head, soft, careful, almost pleading. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I picked it up, sat at my dining table, and slid my finger under the seal. Inside was a neatly folded letter and an old photograph. The paper felt worn, like it had been handled many times. I set the picture aside for a moment and began to read. The first few lines seemed innocent enough. My mom writing about how much she loved me, how proud she was of the woman I'd become. But halfway down the page, the tone shifted. My eyes moved quickly over the words, but my mind refused to keep up. She wrote that the man in the photograph was my biological father, not Thomas, the man who had raised me my entire life. She explained that before she married him, she'd had a short but intense relationship with someone named David Lawson. She got pregnant, but David didn't know. She ended the relationship and never told him. When she met Thomas, he agreed to raise me as his own. They decided to keep the truth between them and never tell anyone else. I stopped reading and picked up the photograph. It was a younger man, probably in his 20s, smiling in the sun. His eyes were the same hazel color as mine. His jawline was sharp, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I had never seen him before, but something about his face felt like a mirror I didn't know existed. I read the rest of the letter with shaking hands. My mom wrote that she had wanted to tell me for years, but feared it would destroy our family. She admitted that lately, she'd been losing sleep over it. And with Mother's Day coming, she decided it was time. She ended the letter by saying, "I hope you can forgive me." I pushed my chair back and stood, pacing the kitchen. My whole life, I'd believed Thomas was my father. Sure, we didn't look much alike, and there were moments when I felt a strange distance between us, but I had brushed it off. Now every little moment of that distance made sense. The lack of shared features, the way he sometimes seemed unsure how to comfort me, the subtle way family medical history never seemed to match mine. Questions slammed into me, one after another. Why hadn't they told me sooner? Why had my dad agreed to live this lie? And why was I only finding out now, through a letter, instead of hearing it face to face? I thought about my brother, Matthew. Did he know? Had he been in on it too? Or was he just as blindsided as I was? Anger rose in me, sharp and hot. It wasn't just the lie. It was the years of trust they had let me build on something that wasn't real. They had stolen the chance for me to know my real father, to understand where I came from. The photograph on the table seemed to stare back at me, silently asking why I had never come looking for him. I picked up my phone and dialed my mom. She answered quickly, her voice bright at first, then cautious when she realized it was me. "Emily," she said, "I know you must be upset, but..." "Upset?" My voice cracked. "You lied to me my whole life. Do you have any idea what it feels like to find out something like this from a piece of paper?" She sighed. "I did what I thought was best for you, for all of us. Your father, Thomas, loves you. This doesn't change that." "Yes, it does," I said sharply. "It changes everything. He's not my father, and you made that decision for me before I was even born." She tried to explain, saying David was unstable back then, that she didn't want to risk bringing him into my life, but I couldn't focus on her reasons anymore. All I could hear was the steady truth behind them. She had taken away my choice to know who I really was. When the call ended, I sat back down at the table and stared at the photograph. I didn't know if David Lawson was a good man or a bad one. I didn't know if he would even want to know me. But I knew one thing. If I didn't try to find him, I would regret it for the rest of my life. The letter wasn't just a confession. It was a challenge, and I was ready to take it. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the photograph. I kept wondering where he was, what his voice sounded like, whether he'd ever think about me if he knew I existed. My mother's words kept looping in my head, how she claimed she was protecting me, how she said it was for the best. But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like being robbed. By morning, I knew I couldn't just sit with the information. I needed answers, and I needed them from her directly. I grabbed my keys and drove to my parents' house without calling first. My heart was pounding the entire way, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. When I pulled into the driveway, my dad's truck wasn't there. It was just my mom's car. I didn't know if that was better or worse. Part of me wanted my dad there to hear the conversation, but another part of me wasn't sure I could look him in the eye yet. My mom answered the door with a tight smile, like she had been expecting me. She stepped aside to let me in, and the smell of her lavender candles filled the air. It was the same smell I'd grown up with, but today it felt heavy, like it was masking something rotten underneath. We sat in the living room. She crossed her legs and clasped her hands together, waiting for me to speak. I didn't waste time. "What's his name?" I asked. She looked confused for a moment, then tried to play dumb. "Whose name?" I pulled the photograph out of my bag and held it up. "You know exactly who I mean. The man in this picture, my biological father." Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she was going to refuse. Then she sighed, leaned back in her chair, and said, quietly, "David Lawson." The name hit me like a jolt. Finally, something concrete. "Where is he now?" I pressed. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "The last time I saw him was before you were born. He wasn't ready to be a father. He had problems, drinking, trouble holding a job. I didn't think he'd be good for you. That wasn't your choice to make." I shot back. "You could have told me. You could have let me decide whether to find him." Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. I'd heard those tears before, and I knew they didn't always mean regret. Sometimes they were just her way of ending a conversation. But this time, I wasn't letting it end. "Do you have anything else? An address, a phone number, anything?" She hesitated, then walked over to the desk in the corner. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small stack of old letters bound with a rubber band. She handed them to me without a word. They were all addressed to her in handwriting I didn't recognize. The return address was smudged on most of them, but one envelope still had it clear and legible. I stared at the address. My mind was already running through the possibilities. What if he still lived there? What if he had a new family? What if he didn't want to meet me? But those questions didn't stop me. I slipped the letters into my bag and stood up. "You should think about what you want from this," she said as I walked toward the door. "Once you open that door, you can't close it again." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "I've been living in a locked room my whole life," I said. "It's time to open it." When I got home, I sat down at my computer and typed his name and the address into a search engine. My heart pounded as results started to appear. Public records, an old phone listing, and even a few photos of him from years ago. The face was older now, but the eyes were still the same hazel as mine. I debated for hours whether to call or write. Calling felt too sudden, too risky. Writing would give him time to process, just like I'd had to. I pulled out a piece of paper and started writing a letter. Who I was, what my mom had told me, and how I had found him. I included my phone number and said I would understand if he needed time to respond. When I sealed the envelope and held it in my hands, it felt heavier than paper. It felt like my entire future was inside. I drove to the post office, dropped it into the mailbox, and stood there for a moment, watching it disappear into the slot. For the first time since opening my mother's letter, I felt a sense of control. The next move wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. The days after I sent the letter felt like the longest of my life. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt into my throat. But it was never him, just work emails, reminders, or spam calls. I kept telling myself not to get my hopes up, that he might never respond. Still, a part of me clung to the image of him opening my letter and feeling something, anything. On the 6th day, I was making coffee when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, with an area code from another state. My hands trembled as I answered. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a man's voice, deep, slightly raspy. "Emily?" The sound of my own name in his voice made my chest tighten. "Yes. Who is this?" "It's David Lawson," he said quietly. "I got your letter." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I sat down at the kitchen table, gripping the edge for stability. "You got it," I said finally, my voice almost a whisper. "Yes," he replied. "And I didn't know. I swear to you, Emily, I never knew you existed." I could hear the sincerity in his voice, but also something else. Regret. Maybe even grief. "Mom said she never told you," I said, "that she made the decision to keep you out of my life." There was a long silence on his end before he spoke. We were young. I was a mess back then, drinking too much, not holding a steady job. I'm not proud of who I was, but if I'd known, I would have tried to be better. I would have tried for you. His words hit me like a wave. I had been prepared for anger, for indifference, but not for this aching honesty from a man who was practically a stranger to me. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," I admitted. "I'm glad you're talking to me, but I can't stop thinking about all the years we lost." "I can't get those years back," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to know you now." We talked for over an hour. He told me about his life now, how he'd gotten sober years ago, started his own carpentry business, and moved to a quieter town. He'd never married, but had dated here and there. He didn't have other children. "You're my only one," he said softly. That sentence made my throat ache. All those years I had believed my family was complete. I had been living without knowing there was this other part of me, this man who carried half my DNA and half my story. At one point, I asked him about the photograph my mother had kept. He laughed quietly. "That picture, I remember the day it was taken. I didn't know she still had it." By the end of the call, we agreed to meet in person. He suggested I visit him in his town. It was a few hours away. I agreed, my heart pounding at the thought of finally standing in front of him. The day of the meeting, I drove with a mix of excitement and nerves swirling in my chest. When I pulled into the small coffee shop we'd chosen, I saw him sitting by the window. His hair was grayer, his face older than the photograph. But the moment our eyes met, something deep inside me shifted. I walked in, and he stood up immediately. For a second, we just looked at each other, both searching for traces of ourselves in the other's face. Then he smiled, a smile so warm and familiar it startled me, and we hugged. It wasn't the awkward hug of strangers. It was like we were making up for decades in one long embrace. We spent hours talking. He told me stories about his childhood, about my grandparents I'd never met, about the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he'd learned. I shared pieces of my life too, my work, my friends, my memories. At one point, he looked down at his coffee and said, "I'm sorry your mother kept this from you. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, but I'm here now, if you want me to be." Something in me softened. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose the future. "I want you to be," I said. When I left that coffee shop, the air felt lighter. I knew there would still be hard conversations ahead, with him, with my mom, with my dad. But for the first time since opening that letter, I felt hope. Driving home from meeting David, my mind was buzzing. It felt strange to think that just a few weeks earlier, I hadn't even known his name. Now, I could picture his smile, hear his voice, and feel the weight of his hug still lingering on my shoulders. It was overwhelming, but in a way that made me feel alive, like a part of me that had been missing was finally sliding into place. But along with that new sense of connection came another, heavier weight, the question of what to do about my mother. I hadn't spoken to her since the day I confronted her. She had sent me a few short texts, just things like, "I hope you're okay," or "We should talk." But I hadn't replied. I didn't know if I was ready, or if I even wanted to be. Meeting David had made me realize how much I'd been deprived of. It wasn't just about knowing who he was. It was about the life experiences, the family history, the countless small moments that could have been mine if the truth had been told earlier. And that truth had been kept from me deliberately. That was something I couldn't forgive overnight. In the days that followed, I started talking to David more often. We'd call every other day, sometimes just to check in, sometimes for hours at a time. He told me about his workshop, how he still built furniture by hand. I told him about my work as a graphic designer, the projects I was proud of, the ones I hated but took on anyway to pay the bills. We were building a relationship slowly, carefully, both of us aware of how delicate it was. One Saturday, he invited me to meet more of his side of the family. I met my aunt, 2 cousins, and even his dog, a goofy Labrador named Max. They welcomed me with warmth and curiosity, and for the first time, I felt the rush of being part of something new, yet deeply familiar. My aunt hugged me like she'd known me since I was born. That moment hit me harder than I expected. I realized I'd been hungry for that kind of unconditional acceptance, without even knowing it. But as much as I was opening a new chapter, the old one with my mother remained unfinished. I couldn't pretend she didn't exist, and I couldn't erase the fact that she had shaped most of my life. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed closure, not for her sake, but for mine. So one afternoon, I drove back to my parents' house. My dad was out again, and my mom answered the door with a hesitant smile. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd shared countless meals over the years. For a few minutes, we just stared at each other. "I met him," I said finally. Her eyes flickered, a mix of surprise and resignation. "David?" "Yes. He's nothing like you described. He's sober. He has a stable life. He's kind." She nodded slowly. "I'm glad he's doing well, but that doesn't change what I believed back then. I was trying to protect you from a man I thought couldn't be trusted." I shook my head. "Maybe you thought that. Maybe you didn't. But it wasn't your decision to make forever. You kept this from me for almost 30 years. You took away my right to know who I am." Her eyes filled with tears. "I know, and I'll live with that guilt for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me." There was a long silence between us. I didn't forgive her. Not in that moment. Maybe not ever. But I also didn't feel the same raw anger I'd felt before. It had shifted into something quieter, like a scar that would always be there, but wouldn't bleed every time I thought about it. When I left her house, I knew we wouldn't be close again, at least not in the same way. Too much had changed. But I also knew I wasn't going to let her choices define me any longer. Now, months later, I spend most Sundays with David. Sometimes we talk about the past. Sometimes we just enjoy the present. I've learned small things about him that make me smile. How he always hums while he works. How he takes his coffee black. How he still keeps a lucky coin in his wallet from when he was a teenager. These little details feel like treasures to me. Mother's Day came around again recently. This time, I didn't go to my parents' house. I spent the day with David, grilling burgers in his backyard, laughing with my cousins, and feeling the sun on my face. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Some people say the truth sets you free. I've learned that's not always true. It can hurt, it can shatter relationships, it can make you question everything. But even when it's painful, the truth gives you something a lie never can, the chance to live honestly. And for me, that chance was worth everything.